Hi there, and welcome to the latest free webinar from New Energy Work. And I'm very, very excited and very happy to have Dr. Cindy Engel with me, who you can see right next to me. Here she is.
Hello.
And Cindy's going to be presenting this evening, the first of 4 free webinars to celebrate the start or the launch of our online course, which is themed Shiatsu, Shiatsu the Scientific Basis. And it's basically about, well, 8-10 years work, I suppose, ever since I did the initial presentation with James Oshman way back in the day at the Berlin Energy Work conference symposium, which basically actually set off the whole idea of new energy work. So yeah, so anyway, I'd like to present Cindy here. She's actually a research biologist. She was researching into the interaction between physiology and behavior, and she wrote this book, Wild Health, which is really fascinating. It's about how animals self-medicate, so they can naturally find herbs and things to eat to balance their own system out. Really amazing book. That was that was her first book, and she's actually working on another book at the moment called Knowing Bodies, which is obviously right in our zone. It's about how information can be passed between obviously therapists and receivers, but more in a general sense in terms of communication between people. And she's actually a Shiatsu practitioner. Hooray! For 20 years. She's one of our graduates from the Shiatsu College Norwich. Very proud to say that. And she's also a very renowned, I would say, Qigong teacher, awesome Qigong teacher, very well known in the neighborhood, and a very well attended Qigong classes that she leads. And that obviously informs her work. So there, that's it. I think, is that all right, Cindy?
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Okay, great. So I'll hand over to you then, and I'll just go and say hi. And chat as usual is going absolutely bonkers. The first thing I want to do, though, is just quickly run a poll and find out if there's any new people. So let's just find out. I'm going to run a poll and just see if anyone is new. Is there anyone here this is the first webinar? Whoa, wow, look at that. Yep, we've got quite a few new people. That's absolutely wonderful. Okay, so you can see what's going to happen. We've got video feeds of Cindy and myself. We've got the slides that will start soon, just down here. If anything is too small, if the slides are too small, you can just drag the line up and down, make us smaller and make the slides bigger. That's worth knowing. The chat's right there. Just say hi to everyone. We had well over 400 people sign up for this webinar, so that's absolutely fantastic. And we've got, we've got 15% of the people are new to the webinar, so that's really great. Welcome, welcome. Okay, so over to you, Cindy.
Okay, hi, thanks very much. Yeah, so what I'm presenting this evening is just a taster of the science of somatic empathy. It's a subject that's fascinated me for over 20 years. I started 20 years ago learning Shiatsu, and really early on, I started to sense what was happening for my clients. And initially it threw me and I didn't know what to do with it. I had lots of strong feelings that weren't my own. And so I found it a bit of a problem. Now, of course, I find it really, really useful. And I've made it a therapeutic tool. It's an essential part of the way I work. So I want to share with you an outline of what is somatic empathy, why do we experience it, and how does it happen? And of course, this isn't from, our own perspective. I'm just simply sharing with you the perspective of scientists and what they think about it. And the idea being that if you experience this, you'll be able to leave the seminar with some sort of scientific language for your own experience that you've got during your work. Okay, so there's about 3 PhDs worth of research on this matter. So to give you a taster, it's going to have to be quite superficial, but all the references and reading list will be available at the end. And you can ask questions anytime, and Cliff will try and interrupt me if need be.
I won't be able to answer them, but we can save them up to the end.
Pass them on to me.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So let's get on to what is somatic empathy. Okay. So the common understanding of the word empathy is basically that it's understanding another person, but that's kind of slipped into the concept of sympathy in common usage. So we talk about someone being empathetic, meaning that they're sympathetic. And of course, from a scientific perspective, empathy just means understanding, and you can be understanding without being remotely sympathetic. You can understand how someone is without taking the next step of compassion or sympathy. So I'm breaking it down here into two different forms. There's cognitive empathy, where we infer intellectually how someone else is. So you know, an example would be, oh, you must feel terrible losing your job. I'm just intellectually trying to understand how you feel. But this central one, the somatic empathy, is when we actually feel how someone else feels. So my heart races when someone else is anxious. I feel deeply sad when someone else is sad, and so on. Yeah. And that's, of course, the aspect of empathy that we're interested in this evening, is this somatic, this bodily experience of empathy. So if we're looking at a scientific definition of what is somatic empathy, it's when you feel physical, emotional, or mental information of another. So I might give you a personal example from a client who presented to me with insomnia and depression and a lot of anxiety. He just lost his wife, and when I was working on him, I felt in my own system, in my own body, as if I was taking some unpleasant medication, a general yuckiness throughout my whole system that I couldn't localize. And I recognized it as when I've taken medication that I don't like or doesn't agree with me. But the other thing that was going around as a query was whether this was a generalized infection. It felt the same as an infection. So I had these, what was interesting was I had these two words, infection and medication, and they were clearly enunciated. So I was hearing them, and they had a question tone to them. I was hearing them inside, but I was also physically feeling these sensations of generalized infection or medication. Now, all very interesting, but the next day I asked him if he felt fine at the time, and he said yes, he felt fine. There was no problem. He was not on medication. He didn't have an infection. But the next day he got an email from the hospital saying that his blood tests suggested that he either had an infection or the medication was wrong. And he was rather spooked by this. And at the time, I was rather spooked by it as well. It was a little bit too accurate for my liking. And but it did kind of spur me on to think, well, what on earth is going on? How is this working? And you know, those of you that have experienced this, you'll know these things happen quite frequently. So at the time, science didn't have much to say about it, but in the last few years, science has really got on board with this. So this is the exciting thing about somatic empathy, is that we can now have some explanations. So what I'm saying on this slide is that it can provide therapeutically useful information for us. And it varies in sophistication. So I've just told you a really complex example of where it's been very specific. But it can be really simple, of just your client has a headache, you get a headache. And what we don't know yet is whether the mechanisms vary according to the level of complexity. What I'd like to do at this stage is stop and do a poll. I'm hoping Cliff will do this for me. Yeah, as to whether you have experienced feeling something that's not yours, which you later discover is the experience of your client. What I'm trying to rule out here is autosuggestion, where your client comes in and says their hip hurts, and then while you're working on them, your hip hurts. A scientist will tell you that's just autosuggestion, it's not interesting. But if you are working on someone and you feel something which you then get confirmed afterwards, that's what I'm interested in. Yeah. So
Okay.
can we see if anyone's got that?
Yeah, sure. Here we go. Just
87%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We've got 65% of the audience. Quite a few more people probably still thinking about
Okay,
it. So
yeah,
we'll probably get a few more just thinking about it. So have you experienced something not yours, which you discover afterwards reflects the experience of your client? Yeah, that's the question. Yeah, there we go. 80%. We're running at 79, 80%. So it's a very, very common experience, isn't it?
It is, and as I would imagine, really, you know, it would have been a pretty short seminar if everyone had said no, and it's just me.
You're the only one, Cindy.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, well, we've got 80%. We've got 80% of the participants have voted now. We've got 78%, so it's pretty much 80%. Yeah,
that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've only got anecdotal data, but talking to psychotherapists, they experience really similar things as well. They pick up somatic empathy when they're in counselling sessions talking. So it's not necessarily a tactile thing, but we might get onto that later as to how that contributes.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop.
Stopping the poll.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the poll. Yeah.
Okay.
Just going to hide that. Thank you very much for voting, everyone. There we go.
So yeah, can we get back to see the chat?
Yeah, the chat should be there.
Okay, I can't see it for some reason.
Yeah, I can anyway, so don't worry about it. It should be there.
I can hide that. Okay.
Yeah.
So the important thing to say at this stage is that somatic empathy is an act of perception rather than sensing or detecting, and it has intentionality. And I'm going to keep coming back to this because it's really important about how it works and what's going on. And the next slide shows us why we think this. So the great thing about people who've got extremes are that they can help explain scientific mechanisms. So we've got these two examples here of synesthetes, people who have been diagnosed as having a sensory disorder. Now, both these guys, Joel and Fiona, insist that there's nothing wrong with them. It's not a disorder. They're just an extreme end of what's going on for all of us. And once we've got into it, you may well agree, because it seems to be just an extreme version of what's going on for us 80%. But Joel Salinas is a doctor, an American neurologist, and he has more than once saved the life of a patient by being able to feel what's going on for his patient in his own body. So the example I liked best from his autobiography was that he was in the emergency room, and a mute patient who had been born without the ability to speak was really struggling, really panicking, and the nurses wanted to just sedate her because she was kicking up such a fuss. But as he walked towards her, he could feel in his own chest that there was a kind of blockage somewhere, and he immediately authorized a scan, and they found a blood clot on her lung that she would have died of. And anyway, so he's able to use it in a medical situation every day. But the interesting thing about Joel is that he gets somatic empathy with inanimate objects. So what this does for us is it tells us that there is at least part of the mechanism of somatic empathy is about perception. It's not about getting something from your client. It's not, you know, part of the mechanism is just your perception. Because he can feel the weight of the armor of a statue as he goes past. He can feel himself drowning in the water of a glass that he looks at. You know, he gets somatic empathy with things, whether they're alive or not. And there's lots of other research which has also been done from a distance. So you can get somatic empathy from a distance. It doesn't have to be proximal. When you're told about something that's happening to someone, you can feel the somatic empathy just from the information that you're hearing. And what's interesting, of course, is that we get it with things that aren't even true. So there's research showing that when wives, this is rather a cruel experiment, but they take a bunch of women and tell them that their husbands have been injured. I don't know why that's funny, but they feel the somatic empathy.
It's a bit unethical, isn't it?
So if they've told them that their husband has been hit on the hand, they feel the pain in their own hand. But the interesting thing is it isn't even true. So we're taking out the truth, we're taking out the fact that it's living interaction, and what you're left with is it's just perception.
Right.
So we have to think about, well, what does that mean? You know, what is perception?
There's some very interesting things in the chat. Do you want me to just read out some of them?
Yeah.
Dawn says, I'm a shiatsu practitioner and counsellor. I have video call counselling sessions and have somatic empathy in those sessions, which I bring into the session. So she actually feels things on video link. Dominic
brilliant.
said, today he was doing a body scan with a client and his throat nearly closed up and he started coughing. And then he found out that he got lung jitsu in the hara afterwards, you know.
Fantastic. Yep.
Angela says, sometimes I feel sensations before the client arrives for the treatment, so that she feels it before they arrive. And this is an interesting one. Molly says, when I'm explaining shiatsu to, and this is quite a funny one, when I'm explaining shiatsu to a new or prospective client, I might give an example of what shiatsu can help with, you know, and many times that she says something, unbeknownst to me, she gives an example that exactly matches what the new client is experiencing. It's like my mind is channeling information from the client back to them, you know?
Yeah. Okay.
So interesting.
Well, great, because we're all, you know, and science is with us, as I will get to in a minute. They are catching up with our experience, which is brilliant.
And what about this one? This is interesting as well for you, Cindy, because of, you know, your interest in the animal thing. Alison says that she's an equine shiatsu practitioner, and this happens to her with every horse that she works on. She gets some kind of somatic empathy, and that includes feeling very sick when they're sick.
And they can't vomit.
They can't vomit. Horses can't vomit. She gets that feeling.
I suspect it's really clear with animals because they haven't got that cognitive bit to get in the way. I mean, when I've worked with animals, I get really clear somatic sensations.
You do,
that they're experiencing. I understand that I was called in to work on a cow in a zoo, and I immediately felt a blocked bowel, which is very uncomfortable. Plants. Oh well, I don't know about that. Yeah, great. Okay, so we've got it, we do it, but I guess what we need to know is that it is to do with perceiving rather than sensing. And what I mean by that is that a computer can detect things that you give it to detect, but it cannot perceive. Perception is a concept of consciousness. And so only conscious beings perceive. And so it is this interaction of consciousness with the information that's causing the somatic empathy. And we'll get to that in a minute. Right. So let's go past our dysfunctional synesthetes, the poor guys. So this is just a list of what scientists have noticed. I mean, you know, the people here on the webinar have noticed lots of wonderful things, but scientists have got a rather limited perspective because they're not working in it every day. But what they've noticed is that imitation and copying and mimicry are completely ubiquitous at all levels, from behavior, posture, gesture, and so on. And it goes on noticeably and imperceptibly. And it's one of the main ways that living things interact is by copying each other. It's how animals understand each other. They copy each other. It's how babies understand mothers understand, but it's how kids understand each other. We mimic, we copy facial gestures, and that's been known for a long time. But this next bit is quite new, which is where psychologists have noticed that when people are interacting, their physiology synchronizes. Now, talking therapists have known this for a long time, that their heart rates and their breathing start to come into synchrony with their client. The wonderful thing about this is you can measure it, you see, so it's not about sort of having perceptions of what they did when they were a child or whatever. These are things that scientists can measure. They can measure your heart rate, your breathing rate, your skin conductance, which says how your emotions are going. And when people interact, their physiology synchronizes. So, things increase and decrease together. And they've given it this name, Interpersonal Physiological Synchrony. Right. And
thank God it's got a name.
And they're very excited about it. And
I bet they are.
And they say it's got no known mechanism. It's a complete mystery to them.
Okay.
But these are psychologists, and they're obviously not talking to any of the other researchers who are researching all the other bits and bobs around this.
That's something that I remember you saying when we had our rehearsal. You were saying that there's very little there's loads of different similar work going on in different disciplines, but they're not talking to each other. Yeah,
and at first, when I started researching this, I thought it was me that was missing all the joined up bits, and then I realised they're just not joined up. They're just not, So we've got the neuroscientists totally engrossed in mirror neurons, and you've got the psychologists totally engrossed in interpersonal physiological synchrony. They don't seem to communicate. And you've got the behaviorists, totally engrossed in gestural mimicry and so on. But what interests me is that they are actually getting to grips with this idea that one person's physiology can influence another person's physiology just by doing it. So, what you and I would call mirroring.
Yeah.
So they've got this thing of stress buffering, where a mother will calm an infant just by calming herself.
That's what we call modeling.
This is just really big news for scientists.
Yeah, that's modeling, isn't it?
Modeling, I know.
Yeah.
But the research on modeling is really only just taking off.
Right. So, but that's not necessarily a conscious thing, though, is it? Mothers do that instinctively. They don't actually, like consciously calm themselves down, do they?
We haven't even got on to the idea of conscious and unconscious yet, because all these mechanisms are able to be completely automatic and unconscious.
Right.
And what I'm proposing, and you would probably propose, is that in our work we deliberately make this conscious. We bring it into our conscious control, whereas these mechanisms are going on unconsciously all the time anyway.
Yeah, sure.
So the conclusion on interpersonal physiological synchrony is that it is ubiquitous. Everyone does it, and they don't know.
Oh, right. Wow. Okay.
And that it's unconscious, and that they say they don't know what the mechanism is.
Right.
Okay. So the other thing that scientists know, that we have these synesthetes, these extreme empaths who feel everything other people feel.
Yeah.
Like poor Fiona on that other slide, she witnessed a man being punched and she went unconscious.
Right.
And that was the first time that she was taken to hospital, and the doctors gave her a diagnosis, which is that you're weird. But it's useful for us to have these extremes, because it just shows there is the mechanism there, and that we've obviously got this spectrum of response to what we're seeing and hearing and processing.
Yeah.
Anyway, the other thing that scientists have got into, as I'm sure you've discussed before, is this concept of mirror neurons in the motor cortex.
Yes, that was a big deal, wasn't it? A while ago, it was a real big deal.
And yeah, because you've got these reductionist scientists who've got to find something physical. They've got to find a neuron doing something,
right,
in order order to account for an experience that we're having. So what they got very excited about was that our motor cortex, which is supposed to tell our body what to do, starts to activate when we're simply watching or listening others doing things.
Right.
And that was really big news. And they called them mirror neurons because it was as if we were reflecting what we're seeing and what we're doing. But it's far more complicated than that, as you know, because what happens is that our motor cortex can finish unfinished actions. If we're watching someone, for example, bake a cake and they only get halfway through, our motor neurons can finish the process. So we're finishing unfinished tasks. We're running simulations of things that we watch and things that we hear. And it isn't just the motor cortex. And that's what's really exciting neuroscientists now is in this last little bit, you can do scans on human brains to show that not just the motor cortex, but the somatosensory and the emotional regions of our cortex respond to visual and auditory input. Now, what that means is that we are we're running internal simulations of anything that we see and hear. So the conclusion that the neuroscientists have come to, whoops, now where have we gone? Let me go back. There we are. Is that understanding the inner state of others relies on implicit physical and emotional simulation, processing the states of others as if they were our own.
Oh, okay.
So the idea is that we're not mirroring at all. We are participating in an internal simulation until we can recognize something, until it has meaning, until it has understanding.
Yeah.
So somatic empathy means that you're understanding something, and we can't understand something unless we recognize it.
Right. Yes.
And so we're running it somatically as well as cognitively, and then trying to find meaning from that. So I'll just take you back a slide.
Monica, just one thing in the chat. Monica says that many studies claiming to have found mirror neuron system activation during action and emotional tasks do not have appropriate experimental conditions to support such a claim. I don't know if you know about that, about how strong the research was in the first place with mirror neurons.
Well, the trouble with the whole concept of mirror neurons is that the neuroscientists are kind of assuming that there's a special set of neurons that evolved just to copy things, and that's not true. What they're finding now is that our everyday cortex is just used as a simulation.
Right, I see. Yes, yeah.
So it's kind of moot now. It's kind of
it's moved on.
Actually,
Sylvia says that she thinks that learning through repetition in traditional martial arts is as part of that process. And I guess it must be, isn't it? It's a sort of that whole master-student thing where you just repeat things and the master gets into a certain state that you experience.
I mean, definitely the traditional way of teaching Qigong is just feel how I feel, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Like you teach that way, feel how I feel, rather than
I do
this and do that. I mean, it's learning by feeling.
With some of the more advanced teacher training techniques as well, energy work teacher training techniques, I actually consciously amplify up the feelings for the group. So if I want to demonstrate something, what I'll do is, first of all, I'll get the entire group to align and form a kind of coherent energy field. And I'll keep doing that until I feel that everyone is tuning in, you know what I mean? And once there's that level of tuning in, then when I demonstrate something, I will actually consciously kind of broadcast. I call it broadcasting, which is basically almost like amplifying the modeling to make it easier to for people to feel that. I've never really thought about it like that, but I suppose that's what I'm doing. I'm creating a situation where it's most likely that that traditional kind of transmission teaching will occur.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you here because Mark's just put something really interesting about the diagnosis of Asperger's. I would not be able to do energy work as you get an overload.
All right. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Very interesting, because we're going to come to that at the end, Mark, where we talk about why some people are good at this and why some people aren't. But I will pick up on that.
Okay. Great. Look, and Alison's saying that if you work in
oh, they all tune in.
On a horse in a barn, they all tune in.
But I do find that, and again, it's just anecdotal observation, but I do find that group animals are really good at this. You don't get an awful lot of somatic empathy with cats.
Oh, really? Oh, because they're individual, you mean?
I mean, it's this. We really, group animals really need to be good at this.
Right. Yes, of course. Yes. Yeah.
And horses are just so tuned into it, I mean, because they really need to feel what everyone else is feeling.
Right. Yes, because you get that with herds, don't you? They react almost like one organism.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track.
Slightly, yeah.
So we're coming to the next question: is why does somatic empathy happen? And this is from the scientist's point of view. What do scientists propose is the reason that we have somatic empathy? And the first reason is really quite interesting. And I've explained this to several of my friends, and their brains have nearly exploded. They can't quite take this, so we'll see how it goes. But
okay. Yeah.
The first reason scientists think somatic empathy happens is that information comes into us through our nerves, and nerves are just digital. They just blip, 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 blip. That's all they can do. And at some point, it has to turn into a 3D perceptual experience.
Yes.
And so the idea of simulating it in your 3D body is that's how you feel it as a 3D object. That's how you make an apple round, is feeling its roundness in your body.
Right. Okay.
Rather than the blip, 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 you see.
Yes.
Well, I got away with that quite easily. That went quite well.
Okay, the chat's been stunned into silence, but you can expect quite a complete flood in a minute. But moving on.
Moving swiftly on. The other reason scientists propose that we have somatic empathy is that it's how we learn to do something rather than how we learn what something is. Yeah, so it's this action perception linking that we'll get to in a minute. But we need somatic empathy to learn how to do things. So it's how children learn to do all their actions. They watch and they embody it. They run the simulation and then they've had a practice run. And it's how we learn to improve things. So learning, vicariously learning actions, how we learn to predict an outcome. So we've got all this somatic simulation running all the time.
Right.
So it's really, really useful. So if we're watching someone skip, our body is simulating how to skip, as well as being told what a skipping rope is. And
I felt myself doing this when you started talking about skipping.
Yes. Yeah. Molly, I mean, what I'm doing here is I'm talking about what Western science thinks about somatic empathy. So they still think that sensory information is mainly through the nervous system. The other thing that scientists propose is that somatic empathy is an ancient aspect of human intelligence that we share with other species, because they're already finding that it's a prelingual form of learning. So it's a form of intelligence. Mm-hmm. The other theory that scientists have got is that this is how we construct reality. So we're getting a bit deep here.
Okay.
But that we experience somatic empathy because all of our reality is enacted. It's constructed through embodiment. As in, We enact reality bodily, and we always have done. We always do, and we'll get to some mechanisms in a minute, but that's one of the theories they do. So it's not that we don't construct reality by making little representations in our brain, which was the sort of old-fashioned view of how we perceive the world, is that there's a representation of the world in our brain. What they're saying now is that you don't do that, you actually enact it, you embody it, and that is it. That is your perception of the world.
So I think therefore I am is out then.
Totally out, yeah.
I think
I feel therefore I am.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Here's a couple of things that Monica's posted up. She says about mimicry is about an exchange of energy. It's not about a phase resonance within the healing environment. I don't know if you've got a comment about that. I don't know whether it's, well, we'll get onto that in a minute, won't we? When you talk about,
I will get onto that. I mean, my own language has shifted to information rather than energy. So I have to think about that. And Molly says, I have to disagree that it's the nerves that receive the info directly. Rather, it's the liquid crystalline water that picks up the frequency information and relays it to the nervous system. So she's expanding out the perception. I did answer that in that what I'm doing is I'm explaining what scientists are happy with at the moment.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's not necessarily your view. You're not owning that.
Necessarily what we're happy with. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I am interested because I'm both. I do like to be able to talk to scientists without them rolling their eyes, and I want to be able to talk to people who are actually experiencing these things, and keep us all in the loop, as it were. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, that's one of the aims of these webinars. It really is to have a language that we can to be able to talk not just to scientists but also just to normal people. About what's happening.
And we have to be clear that we are learning experientially, and experiment will always be behind experience. By definition, it has to be.
Yes.
So scientists will always lag behind our experience. We will always be on the frontier because we're moving on all the time with our experience, and we're not spending 10 years exploring this one thing that we found.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there's always this lag, and it doesn't mean that that we're wrong or they're wrong. It just means there's a time lag.
But also the other interesting thing is, of course, is that a lot of this work is traditional Oriental arts, isn't it? What I mean? That I think the thing about the Eastern technology of, Qigong and Shiatsu and Chinese medicine is so much more advanced in terms of the mind, how you can use the mind in different ways, how you can alter your perception, how you can moderate your own body-mind connection. I mean, it's so sophisticated in that way, isn't it?
I know. We really have been held back by the idea that the mind is housed in the brain. That simple little phrase, it's really held back progress on so many areas. Yeah. But it is changing. I mean, now neurophysiology. That's
very exciting for us, though, isn't it?
It's
changing. It's so exciting for us.
It is exciting, yes. Yes, and it's even more exciting for them. They have no idea that this was happening. So yes, this was in the Neuroscience Review. Understanding others relies on us simulating their states as if they were our own. Okay. This is totally new to science, that understanding others is not purely a brain thing, it's also a body thing. Scientists are shocked by the somatic role in intelligence, and they're shocked by what they call vicarious activation of our brain by what's going on for other people. There's been this big assumption that our motor cortex and our sensory cortex in our brain is a private thing, and now they're really shocked to discover that actually it's more of a social, interactive thing. Yeah. Okay, next slide. Sorry. So how does it happen? And this is according to scientists.
Right. Okay.
I feel like I'm the devil's advocate here. So the reductionist paradigm, as you know, the dominant paradigm up to now. So one theory is that there is, and this they've looked at visual perception, is that one nerve pathway goes to the visual regions at the back of the brain so that you can understand what you're looking at, and another pathway goes to the motor regions to simulate what you're looking at. And this is called the dual pathway model. And the assumption is that the somatic simulation pathway is normally damped down, it's normally inhibited, so that we're not thrown around by everything that we see. Because if you remember Fiona, the synesthete that got knocked out when she watched someone getting punched, I mean, her life is absolutely terrible because everything she looks at happens to her in full-blown, you know, technicolor. And what scientists are suggesting is that that pathway is kind of dampened down in us. But you can see how amazingly reductionist they're being here. Okay. You know, and it's very unlikely that this is how it's all happening. No. But you know, this is what they're thinking. Okay. And we've also got now that the concept of mirror neurons is being replaced by this term vicarious activation. And the interesting thing, I think, is that they're finally also accepting that the motor and somatosensory stimulation is connected to emotions. So this is how, you know, we can feel the emotions of our clients as well as see the postures that they're doing. Yeah. And down the bottom we get to this bit that I think Mark was talking about, which is that scientists have found that people who are strongly empathic have strong vicarious reactions in their brain, which means that their brains respond very strongly to simulating what they are watching. Right. Yeah. And people who aren't very empathic don't. And that if people have damage to this part of the brain, they can't feel the emotions of other people. Right. Okay. So as reductionist scientists like to do, they're trying to find an area of the brain that does it. Right. And I'm sure it's going to be just part of the story. Yes. But what I have found is that, you know, if you're strongly empathic, you've got this physical internal simulation happening strongly. And other people who aren't very empathetic don't have this internal simulation going on. No. Oh, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. The reason, you know, being is that it's for understanding. Yeah. So the more advanced explanation is using a systems paradigm, is that we're running a somatosensory cycle of feeling and interpretation. And I think I've got a diagram. I don't know. Did I put a diagram? Oh, yeah. Here we are. So when we're working on a client, we're feeling inside. So we've got the internal simulation happening inside. You're interpreting it. And that will be whether you can recognize what you're feeling. And then you'll be setting up a different intention, a different question, feeling the response to that in your own body and interpreting that. And that cycle will go round and round and round. Yeah. Right. So, you know, if you're working on a client and you feel a rush of anxiety, if I feel a rush of anxiety, I don't just leave it at that. I will ask, you know, what's this anxiety about? What can I do about this? Is there a region I should work on? You know, and then that changes the somatic response, and that changes my interpretation, and I get this cycle going. And this is participatory perception. We are participating in the perception of our client. Right. And the crux of the matter about somatic empathy being perception rather than sensing is that all perception is now thought to be participatory. Yeah, we don't just sense the world as it is, we participate in our perception of the world.
Yes, that's a bit like the theory dependence of observations, or how you can recognize things because of language, and it's in that kind of area, isn't it? The way that how we set ourselves up changes what we perceive. It's something like that.
Yes, but there's a participation in the actual processing of the sensory information you've got coming in. So
right.
we're not like robots that, you know, the information of anxiety comes in from our client and we register anxiety. I mean, what we've got is a cacophony of information coming in, and we're participating in selecting anxiety out of that, aren't we?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. It's highly edited, isn't it? What we actually perceive is highly edited, isn't it?
And we'll be running that as simulations, physical simulations, as well as through cognitive analysis.
Right. Yeah, so there's a massive stuff going on then.
Yes, and it all depends on all these preset filters that you've put in, like your intention,
yes,
your attention, all those preset filters. So that's why you'll always get what's relevant. Because that bothered me for a long time, is why do I only get information that's relevant to this client?
Yes.
You know, why aren't I picking up everything else?
Yes.
Or why aren't I picking up something that's completely irrelevant from them? You know.
Yes, absolutely.
Why did I pick up the words medication and infection, which were the two words that, you know, the doctors wanted to talk to him about? And, you know, the reason is that you've got all these set filters filtering all the time for meaning and relevance in the participation that you're doing, as you're simulating, recognizing, interpreting, and at every stage filtering out for what I think is meaning.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Which is completely different to, you know, there's a red object, touch a red object, red.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. No, I totally agree. Yeah, it's a highly participatory and highly filtered experience. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's why, presumably, you know, you teach the way you do about simplifying everything back to a blank, open page if you can, because you've got this, you know, there's enough complexity of information coming in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's one of the things we were talking about earlier, wasn't it? About the whole, it's making me really, really think about HARA diagnosis and what really happens. We were talking about that, about I think it's so fascinating that Masnaga, and there's something in the chat about Masnaga, which I'll just read out in a minute. But Molly says, didn't Masnaga describe the shiatsu relationship as the giver becomes the receiver and the receiver becomes the giver? In other words, it's like an interactive thing. It's so interesting that Masnaga had this kinesthetic approach to teaching shiatsu theory. So he basically instinctively knew that for us to tune in to different energy states, or whatever you want to call it, information from the client, we need to have some kind of experience. And so instead of just doing it theoretically, you know, like, oh, the heart is related to the shen, you know, we do exercises on what it's like to have a disturbed shen, what it's like to have a calm shen. Because then when you touch, because that's the thing that really I'm starting to deconstruct now. When you touch say the heart diagnostic area in the HARA, several things are going on. One is the actual physical condition, or what you feel in the area itself, which is a physiological thing. But a lot of what you feel is, I think, is filtered somatic empathy with the information about that vibration, if you want to call it that, or that information that's in their energy or in their body mind system, which again, like you say, you are able to identify because you have experience of it, you know?
And you run it through all your conceptual models,
right? So
and that's why I've said before, it doesn't matter what conceptual model you've got. You know, I honestly don't believe that you know, there are ones that are 100% correct, and you know, I think they're all roughly okay. And as long as you've got one, you can do some perception.
Yes, and you can do something as well about it.
Yes, you can do something with your intention.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And Pauline always said that. Pauline said, it's much better to just have one system that you know really well.
Yes. And it doesn't matter what it is.
Hundreds of systems that you only know a little bit.
It's true. I really feel that more and more now, because, you know, and the clearer you are, the more clarity you've got.
Yes.
In that system.
Yes.
The clearer you're going to be. And
that's interesting, because Masnaga always said that. Masnaga always said that diagnosis, it wasn't important whether diagnosis was correct or not, whether the actual, it doesn't matter. The important thing was it enabled you to focus on something, to get information and to focus on it. And that was far more important than whether it really was Kyo, is this really Kyo, is this Jitsu sort of thing.
And I can see now why it would be really unlikely to get 3 people getting the same horror diagnosis. I mean, how could you possibly, if it's participatory perception?
Well, that's really interesting, because when I was apprenticing with Pauline, when I started, because I spent like weeks and weeks and weeks, and she was doing loads of clients. So I did hundreds of clients. She got me to do horror diagnosis on every one. The interesting thing was, and I had to write them down, and she would kind of look at them afterwards, you know. And the interesting thing, when we started, I was getting about 50% the same. But after 3 months of being in there every day, you know, like 7, 8 clients a day, it slowly got more and more consistent. I think the reason for that was just because we were both creating this kind of coherent field, or some, you know, there was some kind of connection there, or we were both somehow merging our perception. Again, because I suppose I was watching her, mimicking her, running a simulation. So basically what happened was the 2 simulations that we were both running, as I learned more and as I watched her more and more, they became, those 2 simulations were much more likely to run together, if you see what I mean, be consistent. That's what was happening.
And of course, the thing is, you know, everybody says, so what are we basing the somatic empathy on? You know, and what scientists are saying is that it's multimodal, basically anything, you know.
Right.
So they've only looked at visual input and auditory input. So they've only looked at they've only studied what we look at, and what we hear becomes simulated in our bodies. But you know, the really exciting thing is they're just starting to look at touch, and they're finding that it's amazingly effective at producing internal simulations. Right. You know, and you'd expect it to, because, you know, you're already in that arena of, you know, kinesthetic arena, aren't you? So
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's hardwired into your somatosensory cortices, so they're going to start simulating. Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant. We've just got 8 minutes left. Cindy, how many slides you've got left? I'll just have a quick look through the chat and see if there's anything else I can pull out for you.
Well, this is my summary slide, saying that somatic empathy is considered by scientists to be normal and ubiquitous, but there is a natural variation between us.
Okay.
The thing we didn't get to talk about is one of the mechanisms called neurological coupling. It's a bit heavy. We did touch briefly on the fact that we enact reality, but again, that's a sort of deep philosophical explanation. It is a perceptual process, and it responds to multimodal sensory input. Basically, any kind of sensory input, we're going to be forming internal simulations and running them. It's considered an aspect of human intelligence shared with other species. And as yet, the research has been limited to what we look at and what we hear, but there's so much more to come. It's a very exciting area of research, which us body workers are ahead of the game. And you know, we'll be looking with amusement at their excitement of these discoveries.
Actually, do you know what? We've got that poll that we haven't launched yet about whether do you use somatic empathy as part of your therapeutic toolset?
Oh yes, I'd like
to run that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just launch this. So, thinking about everything that Cindy's been talking about, we've been talking about. And reflecting on your own work for a moment, just reflect on how you work. The poll says, do you use somatic empathy as part of your therapeutic toolset? You might not call it somatic empathy at the moment, or maybe you do now, but you may not have done before this webinar, but you probably recognize some of the mechanisms and some of the functions. So look, we're coming out with a massive majority in saying yes.
About the same percentage as the people who experienced it. I mean, it is incredibly useful tool, and the point is that it's you know, what the research is showing is what we know, is that it's incredibly accurate in terms of it is your perception.
Yes.
You know, it's, and you know, in the early days when you're starting out, you tend to think, is it an imagination? But it's not. It is perception.
Yeah. Here's an interesting post from Catherine. She says, what if a mother cannot be empathic with her child? Will a child be able to recognize feelings or only copy its mother's unempathy, or learn this anyway, as it's potentially empathic? In other words, is that connection, that empathy, does it come from a learned response, or, I mean, what do you think from a developmental point of view?
I think it's a completely different topic, really.
Oh, is it? Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's to do with development, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and again, it's a different group of people who aren't communicating with anybody else.
Oh, really? Who are investigating that?
So, I mean, there's an awful lot of work in on you know, autism and empathy, and the difference between sociopaths and psychopaths, and it is actually quite interesting. I have read quite a bit around the difference between sociopaths and psychopaths, and how that, you know, they can feel empathy but not compassion, and the others can feel, so. Oh yes. And like breaking down the different components. You know, the inability to run a simulation, or yes, there is an ability to run a simulation, but they don't care. You know, people who run a simulation and enjoy the pain that they're inflicting on you because they feel the pain themselves. You know, so. Oh wow, it does get really complicated. It gets really weird. Yeah. I'm going to just share your website with everyone, and I will obviously when I send you the link to the recording, I will send you a link to Cindy's website as well, because you might want to just subscribe to her blog. Some fascinating stuff on there. She's just published an article in the Shat Society News, and I can't wait. Like a lot of people, I can't wait for part 2. Actually, really, if people, you know, would be happy to share their experiences of somatic empathy with me, it would greatly help me with the production of the book, because the more I can talk about the general experience of people, the better. Oh, great. So you could be in your book then. That would be lovely. Chance to be a book. Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to hide that for a second. And I've just put this list up at the end of 2 key papers. They're review papers, and a list of books. And these really would give you everything you need to know about what science thinks on the topic, if you need to, if you're interested. Yeah, brilliant. And here's another posting from Jane in London, one of our Shiatsu college teachers. She says, what about, we talked about this the other day as well. What about the receiver empathizing with the practitioner? I know. This is why we need to have as quiet and neutral key field as we can. Yeah. For example, with alignment ? I mean, again, I do, and we were saying, you know, do we use it in as a therapeutic tool set? And I do assume that my clients are, you know, running simulations of me, because I am generally calmer than them. You know, that's how bad the world is. Yeah, that's what I always say to students. I said, you know, the therapeutic process with energy work is based on the idea that we're more balanced than our clients. If only that was always true. Well, it doesn't. But Pauline had a good rejoinder for that. She said it doesn't matter what state you're in. It's more important what process you're involved in. Mm-hmm. And she gave the description. She gave the analogy of when you have self-help groups. Quite often, self-help groups are better than medical experts, because the person's been through that experience and they've been able to transform themselves. Yeah. Well, and so, you know, she was saying, well, it doesn't matter if you've got stiff shoulders and they've got stiff shoulders, as long as when you're working with them, you're actually releasing this. That's what they'll feel. Yes. And in fact, the more experience you have of their problem, the more helpful you can be, can't you? Because they can run a simulation of you dealing with that. Of course. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Bingo. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm not going to try and get every sickness under the sun just for my clients. But it is true that, as you said, that, you know, that's one of the advantages of
being older, isn't it? You've had more experience, you've experienced other people's pain, your own pain, and so you've got more to offer in that way of run all those simulations you've run and what you can share.
Yeah.
Okay, Cindy, it's been a delight. It's really interesting. Yeah. And I totally I'd just like to read out one last thing. Alan says, thank you, Cindy and Cliff. I thought I was going bonkers. No, you're not going bonkers. It's just called Somatic Empathy.
80% of us are bonkers. Yeah.
80% of us. Yeah. We're all in good company, aren't we?
Yeah. Brilliant.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've come to the end of our hour. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much. And we'll send you a link to the recording and a link to Cindy's website. And don't forget, we've got 3 more exciting free webinars coming up. And of course, our online course, if you want to really get into the whole subject, that's going to be launched next month. We've got Dan Keown coming. Should be really interesting. So thank you very much for tuning in. And thank you, Cindy.
Thank you.
Bye.